Piratas del Caribe.
Pirates of the Caribbean. In the past 24 hours, the United States has seized 2 new oil tankers serving Venezuela. In one of the cases, the seized tanker did not even appear on the list of vessels sanctioned by the United States. In line with what was predicted long ago on this channel, Donald Trump's administration has begun a new phase of US foreign policy, the phase of blatant imperialism, in which extrajudicial killings and acts of piracy have become the norm of everyday life. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning.
Muy buenas noches, muy buenas tardes y muy buenos días. Desde Berlín, Alemania, y con bastante retraso comenzamos.
From Berlin, Germany, and with quite a delay, we begin broadcast number 306 of Demolishing Myths Talks. Thank you very much for joining us, and please remember to support us with a thumbs up, comments, subscriptions, the recently reactivated memberships, our PayPal account, and of course, also follow us on our social media, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. On the other side of the screen, eager to join in, we're joined from Madrid, Spain, by Mr. Fernando Moragón. Fernando, how's everything going?
Buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, to the part of the world where you are and to those abroad. The first thing to say is that the delay is the fault of the Russian hackers. Oh, sorry, I don't know why. It's just that after hearing the Europeans, von der Leyen and company, all day saying it was the Russians, it's rubbed off on me. What were the Russians supposed to have done? No, this was Trump. No, it wasn't the Russians. Anyway, well, the first thing to say is, let's see. Time to go to the commercials. First of all, a sponsored link by Demolishing Political Myths for Demolishing Political Myths. Basically, self-sponsored. If you want to know, what does this cute teddy bear have to do with anything? And no, it's not going to be raffled off, I'm telling you now, because it cost me a fortune, at least 3 or 4 euros. Well then, what does it have to do with geopolitics? In the episode, or the Friday show, dedicated to several topics, I explain, I won't say when or where, what this teddy bear, this cute panda, has to do with geopolitics and the intensity of the situation in the Pacific. That said, let's move on to the next thing, all for the modest price of 2,500 euros. Indeed, let's move on, dear Fernando. Well, first things first, this needs to be clear, because there are many people right now who are, for example, in the Southern Hemisphere. In the Southern Hemisphere, generally, the weather is nice, it's vacation time, beach time, and so on. For instance, there are also people who, even if they're not in the Southern Hemisphere, might be in other parts of the Northern Hemisphere, but also enjoying good weather, beaches, etc. All right, the first thing to say after these events that Ezequiel and I are about to discuss and describe about pirates of the Caribbean, who in fact are no longer just from the Caribbean. The Caribbean, the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, anywhere works. Well, the first and most important thing to say is this. If you're at a beach, you see a kid with a float you like, you go and take it from him. So just like that, you take it away from him. And then the father comes along, does something and says, well, look behind you, which is basically doing the same thing but on a bigger scale. In other words, you're now justified so that when you go to the beach, out there in the sea, boom, you can steal whatever you want, the umbrella, whatever you feel like. Because that's basically what Trump is doing. But on a grand scale, in proportions, we're already in the anything goes stage. That is large-scale piracy, like in the good old days of the British pirates. The so-called Sir Francis Drake, who was strictly a pirate, well, a privateer because he operated under letters of marque, meaning royal authorizations to practice piracy. But we're in a new golden age of piracy, and, well, we'll talk about that now.
Precisely because in this broadcast we're going to focus, first of all, on Venezuela. Fernando, today I wanted to start the program with a special dedication, following a very beautiful message I received tonight from a great man, a great Venezuelan, although he was actually born in Uruguay. He became Venezuelan by choice. This gentleman here, many of you will surely remember him, used to begin by saying, "Greetings, friends, crew members of our beloved, polluted, and unique spaceship."
The same one that, since the last time we met through these means, has made another turn on its imaginary axis and, of course, continues to generate events in full development.
Well, Mr. Walter Martinez, Professor Walter Martinez, a great figure in geopolitics, who for almost 20 years was on Venezuelan television in the early mornings, but broadcast throughout Latin America, hosted a program called Geopolitical Dossier, a spectacular show about geopolitics. A pioneer, back when geopolitics seemed like something strange, even crazy. Well, he produced that program. Later, he left his spot for various reasons. But he's still with us. And through his wife Lida, he sent us a very nice message of congratulations yesterday, dear Fernando. So today's program is dedicated to him. And by the way, his shows from 20 years ago, Fernando, basically predicted everything that's happening today. When you watch those programs, they seem current, dear Fernando, because that's geopolitics. Even though we present everyday events, the major geopolitical trends follow much deeper patterns. But of course, not everyone, as Walter Martinez naturally could, is able to untangle these issues and present them as clearly as he did.
Didáctica como él, así que comenzamos con esta dedicatoria y comenzamos, Fernando, directamente con las...
So we begin with this dedication, and Fernando, let's go straight to the images shared by Ms. Christine Owen, Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. A few hours ago, on her X account, she posted these images, 10 days after Ms. Pam Bondi, Attorney General of the United States, had also shown images through an X account, or Twitter as it used to be called, of the first kidnapping carried out by US Marines with the assistance of the Coast Guard.
La asistencia de la Guardia Costera estadounidense, en aquel caso, el secuestro de un petrolero.
In that case, the hijacking involved an oil tanker called Skipper, sanctioned in 2022 for trading Iranian crude. Well, yesterday a new development came to light. A second oil tanker, departing from Venezuela, full of oil, this time bound for China, no less, was hijacked again. And while we present this long video, we must also remember that reports are already emerging about the ongoing pursuit of a third American oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela, also by the US Coast Guard, according to US media themselves. Dear Fernando, what analysis can we make of this situation?
Well, let's see. In principle, we'd have to wait and see, but there are a few things we can say. Notice that it's no coincidence these attacks on oil tankers have increased. It doesn't matter anymore whether they belong to sanctioned or non-sanctioned countries or where they depart from. In other words, this could be interpreted in one way or two, at least two possible ways, and surely there are more. One, Trump, in that situation he's in with his advisors and the politicians around Trumpism, gets contradictory messages. Attack Venezuela, don't attack it. Right? That is, they're tangled up in those disputes where they can't agree because the advisors right now are terrible. And this reminds me, though it doesn't only apply to the American advisors dealing with former non-Soviet states, but to any part of the world. And I remember seeing a few days ago a former Russian diplomat who said, the problem is that back in the Cold War era, the United States had outstanding experts on Russia, that is, on the Soviet Union, who knew an enormous amount, who spoke Russian, who really knew their stuff. The problem now is that they don't have them anymore. Now they've got a bunch of incompetence. They're experts the same way I could be an expert, I don't know, in Swahili, which I know nothing about. Same thing. And this also applies to Venezuela. That is, if before there could be real experts in the different U.S. administrations and so on Venezuela, on Latin America, on each country, even on each region within a country, Now there aren't. And that's why we're seeing a Trump administration that can't seem to make up its mind.
Que no termina de decidirse. Es decir, que está anunciando que va a atacar,
In other words, he's announcing, I'm going to attack. I've just labeled Venezuela as a terrorist country or one that promotes terrorism and such terrorist organization and so on, the government, whatever. And in the end, it's still all in this haze, which would be the first thing. The attacks on small boats, those little launches and such, which they still carry out from time to time. But well, since that no longer makes headlines, there comes a point when it stops leading the news in the United States. And now it seems we've moved on to the phase of, since we're in an embargo phase, but that happened years ago, so it's nothing new in Venezuela. Well, now we're directly going to seize oil tankers going to or coming from Venezuela or somewhere else, and vice versa. From a media standpoint, sure, fine. But from the standpoint of actually hurting Venezuela's capabilities, it's limited, if not minimal. What could be the reason for this?
¿A qué puede obedecer esto? A que mientras hay ese debate interno, porque no tienen un plan.
While that internal debate is going on, because they don't have a plan, that's clear, no firm plan, and they're building it as they go depending on events, well, let's do something that makes headlines. That's one thing. Two, this, let's say, rise in attacks on ships and the seizure of oil tankers could also be due, and it's not mutually exclusive, to the fact that, let's not forget, they need to start filling headlines with whatever they can. Why?
Titulares con lo que sea. ¿Por qué? Porque Trump nuevamente, una vez más,
because Trump, once again, goes back to the big internal problem he has inside, which is this one, in which the Democrats have brought up again with a new batch of photos and so on. Even the Republicans, who, well, were the ones who set up the procedure for declassification, are criticizing it. I think too little has been declassified, and poorly at that. That is, most of the documents are so redacted that you can only read the title. So this, but even so, you can still see a lot of photos and such. I've been able to see some of the things that have been published, and, well, they need to cover up this issue again with something that apparently has more media impact.
Aparentemente tenga como más repercusión mediática. También puedo obedecer a esto. No olvidemos que las crisis internas.
It could also be because of that, right? We see that the internal crises in the United States are often resolved through crises abroad. That is, by provoking crises abroad. I think that's what they're doing right now. They have to do something about Venezuela. Also, if they do something that fills the news and distracts a bit from the Epstein issue, even better. But they still don't have a clear idea of what to do. And that's dangerous. Why? Because it means you don't have a plan, and in the end, you're just reacting to events, letting them drive you, both internal and external ones. And that's always dangerous.
And
in that context, Fernando, if we were to deliberate on Venezuela's possible reactions to this situation, how should Venezuela respond to it? Considering the internal situation of US politics, the Epstein issue, the internal disputes, the conflicts within the MAGA movement, at a meeting, at a political rally held yesterday, within the framework of this organization created by the late Charlie Kirk, called Turning Point, yes, Turning Point USA, in which all the key figures of the new far right also take part, as well as those of Trumpist conservatism. Well, they started directly by insulting each other. Shapiro, Candace Owens, and Tucker Carlson himself. All these internal political issues, Trump's indecision because of the arguments within his own cabinet. And on the other hand, these seizures, to which Venezuela could respond militarily, but which might provide an excuse for a larger intervention. So then, Fernando, what is the right point for Venezuela to respond to this as forcefully as possible, but without creating an even worse situation than the current one?
I think what they're doing is calling a meeting of the United Nations Security Council, filing diplomatic protests, talking with their partners. So they also protest, as Russia and China are already doing, for example. In that area, they're being quite active, taking initiatives. And then, of course, Venezuela must not give any pretext that the Trump administration could use to justify a possible invasion. Well, I think there should never be an invasion, but who knows? Or a drone attack, missile strikes, and so on, or anything else. That is, beyond diplomacy, what they have to do is basically wait for the aggressor, which is the United States, to make the next move.
El agresor, que es Estados Unidos. Es decir, ellos pueden seguir funcionando perfectamente.
That is to say, they can keep functioning perfectly well within the limitations imposed by these kinds of things. But in the end, the one who comes out looking like an unjustified aggressor is the United States. Because come on, they've stolen my Venezuelan land, give me back my oil. It's laughable, to say the least. So, well, the one who ends up looking like a pirate is the United States. And we shouldn't forget the broader context, for example, in South America. This didn't just start now, but let's say that under Trump, they really tightened the screws on the policy we were talking about a couple of weeks ago. The one that's, let's say, formalized in the national security doctrine, the national security strategy. Regarding Latin America, it's a hardline Monroe Doctrine 2.0.
Con respecto a Latinoamérica, Doctrina Monroe 2.0 dura. Y lo estamos viendo. Porque lo que quieren es hacerse que de lo...
And we're seeing it because what they want is to take control of energy resources, in Venezuela's case, and also other kinds like minerals and so on. I'm saying this because the current context is getting worse and worse. Let's not forget, Argentina, unfortunately, with that lunatic Milei applauding any nonsense Trump does. Now, even worse luck with Chile, with Cast, who has openly called for the invasion of Venezuela, the son of a Nazi. Look, when I say son of a Nazi, I'm just stating facts, meaning those are the facts. Nothing more. It is what it is. Unfortunately, Bolivia also has a government opposed to Venezuela. Correct me if I'm wrong, you know more. Paraguay is the same. Ecuador, well, terrible. And Peru too.
Terrible. Y Perú, pues también. Es decir, quiero decir que cada vez están cambiando, estamos viendo una ola de cambios de gobiernos.
Things are changing all the time. We're seeing a wave of governments that are favorable to the United States and opposed to what we could broadly call left-wing politics. Just like when the Kirchners were in power in Argentina, or even the lukewarm Boric in Chile. There's still Petro's Colombia, but we'll see what happens in the next presidential elections. Mexico now has a president who can't really do much, for obvious reasons. Because it borders the United States and already has enough to deal with just making sure the Americans don't cause some kind of disaster. So right now is not the time to rush into doing anything crazy. Quite the opposite. It's the time to let the aggressors make the first move, to let them move their piece on the board, and for you to wait, so that they're the ones who make the mistakes. You're defending yourself. That is, you're not attacking anyone. You're defending your country's sovereignty. And that's supported by the international community, which is not the West. In general, well, and those vassals that little by little are growing in Latin America, in the United States. So you're at a moment when you have to be on the defensive, waiting and watching. Why? Because the circumstances aren't favorable. So, well, let the Americans be the ones who make mistakes. Let them do whatever foolish things they need to do. You obviously keep up the tension, keep it at the level of the population, the armed forces, and so on. But let them be the ones who make the mistakes. At least that's how I see it, given the context, unfortunately, in which Latin America is sinking. But, you know, there's more to it. I mean, for obvious reasons, that regression we're seeing, well, let's say the latest case of Cast is particularly striking because he's a staunch Pinochet supporter. And yes, his father, a staunch Nazi, and a particularly disgraceful man. But we're seeing problems in Honduras itself, well, El Salvador with this man, Bukele. In short, all because of NATO.
The latest information, that's why I'm looking a bit to the side and not directly at the camera, comes from Bloomberg. The United States is still pursuing a third Venezuelan oil tanker, still searching for a third vessel near its shores. The tanker Vela 1, a ship flying the Panamanian flag, is sanctioned by the United States, unlike the second tanker, named Centuris or Centurious, which is not under sanctions. However, following this situation, just a few hours after the first reports of the seizure, Anna Kelly, the White House Deputy Press Secretary, issued a clarifying statement after the release of the first images early yesterday morning, explaining that although the second tanker itself was not sanctioned, its cargo was. PDVSA's oil seems to be sanctioned as such. That's the justification. This third tanker, the Vela 1, does appear on the sanctions list. The interception attempt took place after the boarding of the supertanker Centuris early Saturday morning and of the skipper on December 10th. For now, that's the situation. This chase on the high seas. Now, Fernando, the other day I presented an idea, a suggestion, some information, based on something I read about Russian oil tankers in the Baltic, in which, according to Swedish public television, citing information from the Swedish Navy, people dressed in military attire had been seen, though without any specific flag, but rather with a patch showing another kind of symbol, basically the little skull used by Wagner's musicians. Could Venezuela carry out an action of this kind, as Russia did in the Baltic Sea, by calling on the Russian military company Wagner, or any other, and placing armed personnel on its oil tankers, without that implying, in the event of a confrontation, the direct involvement of the Venezuelan armed forces, since private mercenaries would be participating? Could it take such an action, or would that still entail too great a risk?
Yo creo que un riesgo demasiado grande. ¿Por qué? Porque Rusia
I think it would be too big a risk. Why? Because Russia can actually do it. Russia is a nuclear power. Right now, it's probably the best trained army in the world with the greatest capabilities, even above the Americans, the United States. And the United States, ultimately, let's suppose there's some kind of incident like that and the Wagner guys who are on the Baltic ships. Well, boom, they take out a Swede or a Baltic person, one of those. Well, the United States isn't going to go over there and say, oh, terrible, this and that. It's not going to do anything. In the case of Venezuela, it's a different situation.
En el caso de Venezuela es un caso distinto. Van a por ellos y lo que están es
They're going after them. And what they're doing is waiting for the slightest, quote-unquote, slip-up. And that's when they'll really come after us. In fact, we're used to there not even being any slip-ups, but rather that the Americans create false flag attacks or simply make them up, like the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which never happened, just to justify their invasions, attacks, and so on. That's why I think the policy here should be to give the Americans zero pretexts, and let them be the ones who discredit themselves with this absolutely deranged policy. On top of that, it's not even well organized.
Ni siquiera está bien organizada, ¿no? Es lo que decíamos antes, que salga para estar diciendo, devuélvame.
That's what we were saying before, that the plan goes around saying, give me back the oil and things like that, or give me back the lands of Venezuela, they're mine. But look, they never were. I mean, it's ridiculous. So let them keep doing that. And then we also have to wait, of course, because right now events in the world are unfolding at an incredible speed. And we're already seeing, for example, how Netanyahu, who I think is going to visit the United States this week, is already telling Trump, hey, we just found out that the Iranians are rearming. In fact, the next to last thing we know is that Iran is ready to carry out the first test of a ballistic missile, the Ramsar V. Well, what's that about? Well, watch out. This one's already a missile. It has a range of 12,000 kilometers, meaning it can hit anyone, including the Americans. That is, as everyone knows, the Iranians don't have nuclear weapons, but it can carry a warhead of up to 2 tons. Wow, a 2-ton warhead is quite a blast. And it's also designed to penetrate fortifications, bunkers, and that sort of thing. Because here's the rumor. It's said that one of the famous bombs dropped on the underground facilities of Iran's civilian nuclear program didn't explode, something the Iranians might have taken advantage of to do reverse engineering. This, of course, can't be verified and is just a rumor, so we can't know whether it's true or not. It could be.
No podemos saber si es verdad o no. Podría ser, es verosímil.
It's plausible. Of course, this has made Netanyahu hysterical, and he's telling Trump, hey, we have to, look, we had proposed attacking Iran, but no, we have to attack now, even before the end of the year. What do I mean by this? That at any moment they might just go boom, and Trump might make one of his characteristic impulsive moves and put the issue of Venezuela on the back burner, shifting his focus to the Middle East or somewhere else. So Venezuelans need to be patient and just hold on. For now, it's time to endure, and then we'll see. We'll see, because Trump could get himself into a lot of trouble, and that could be an extraordinary lifeline for Venezuela. So, let's see.
Here, the government's response so far is the statement released by the Venezuelan government. The Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela categorically denounces and rejects the theft and hijacking of a new private vessel carrying Venezuelan oil, as well as the forced disappearance of its crew, committed by military personnel of the United States of America in international waters. This serious act of piracy involves the blatant commission of a crime established in Article 3 of the 1988 Convention for the suppression of unlawful acts against the safety of maritime navigation, and so on. The colonialist model that the United States government seeks to impose through such practices will fail and will be defeated by the Venezuelan people. The Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela reaffirms that these acts will not go unpunished and will apply all corresponding sanctions, including filing a complaint before the United Nations Security Council. This is the response, apparently in line with Fernando Moragón's analysis.
So that's it. They're doing what they should, meaning they're mobilizing diplomatically to make it clear that the one violating, well, not just violating anymore, but crushing international law is the United States. In other words, as has been rightly pointed out, the pirate, the Caribbean pirate, is the United States. And everyone should be clear about that.
Perhaps precisely because of this, so far neither President Nicolás Maduro nor Diosdado Cabello, perhaps the second most powerful figure in the Venezuelan government, has made statements of the same magnitude as those they issued about the seizure of the first oil tanker 10 days ago. However, Vladimir Padrino López did present something.
Vladimir Padrino López, el ministro de Defensa.
The Minister of Defense. They're out of control. They're desperate. A desperation that is dangerous, certainly dangerous in the hands of people so supremacist and so powerful. It's very dangerous, of course, but that's not going to intimidate us. So we're moving forward on the path of development, of prosperity, of building what is ours, of building our own doctrine, and we're doing it every day for the dignity and sovereignty of Venezuela, to two saints. And that message we must start by updating the map, because the order from our commander-in-chief is that every company, public or private, must have its own unit to guarantee production and also to defend production. So the combat units are there. Let's
Perdón, ahora sí. Hay una parte de las declaraciones.
Sorry, now yes. There's a part of Vladimir Padrino López's statements, with Caracas metro cars behind him. López's rejection of these actions, his warnings, but without any concrete action, perhaps precisely to avoid creating the perfect excuse. Here, Fernando, something just uncovered, the publication in Spanish from the US Department of Homeland Security titled Prepare to Board. This publication appeared shortly after Kristi Noem's post yesterday, with the earlier video showing the seizure of the second ship. And here, in a way, they were responding to the reason behind this seizure, this confiscation, with that text. Prepare to board this morning.
Prepárate para embarcar esta mañana. La Guardia Costera de Estados Unidos en
The United States Coast Guard, in coordination with the Marines, carried out a lightning operation to seize the tanker Centuris. The identity of this vessel has been confirmed here. It is not sanctioned, by the way. That's why the Centuris tanker is suspected of transporting oil subject to US sanctions. The iron hand of the joint US military and federal forces rules the waves. And some images here. Well, ruling the waves. Prepare to board. Here's the justification for the suspicion of a sanctioned cargo. Something, by the way, completely illegal. A unilateral sanction by one country. But not even the ship itself is sanctioned, only the cargo, and not officially sanctioned either, just suspected. A total and absolute outrage. Yes, of course.
Total y absoluto.
Look, the good thing we have in these rather turbulent times, that is, in these times of war, of world war, as you know I claim, is that there's no longer time to craft elaborate masks or disguises to cover up all kinds of actions. No, now it's done directly. Hey, if I have to play pirate and seize a ship, I don't care if it's sanctioned or not, I just do it, period. That's it. In other words, all our masks have fallen off, and there's no time for that nonsense anymore. That's the good part, let's say. And then there's something I don't know if they realize, of course, or at least from the outside it looks that way. The ridiculous figure they're cutting. I mean, look, after that ridiculous episode, unfortunately, with victims, but still ridiculous, the most powerful fleet in the world comes out bragging that they've destroyed a small motorboat belonging to some fishermen. And you think, come on, as a feat or an act of heroism, that doesn't really count, does it? Honestly, anyone could do that. And then, on top of that, those tankers they're talking about don't even have anyone on board, just the sailors. That's it. There's no resistance at all. I mean, come on, sir. It's not even that you're acting on the same level as the Somali pirates, for example. You're below that. In the sense that at least the Somali pirates have to face ships that actually have armed crews. Neither this nor that. I mean, you are operating at a lower, more pitiful level than the Somali pirates. But come on, this means that if the Somali pirates, who go around in a few small boats, and, well, there was a whole Operation Atalanta, launched by NATO to fight those pirates and so on who were engaged in that kind of activity, then right now you're actually below the Somali pirates. Why? Because even the Somali pirates can do this. This is an image, even though they keep telling us that no, that the fleet rules the seas, the waves, and all the foam the waves create and everything else, right? I mean, this is really a pathetic image of the U.S. Navy, because what they are doing is truly pitiful.
Editorial del diario New York Times.
Editorial from the New York Times just minutes ago, as an example of the internal disputes in the United States. Pay attention to the New York Times headline from a little while ago. Trump takes the imperial presidency of the United States to a new level. In his first year back in the White House, President Trump has greatly expanded executive power while adopting the trappings of royalty in ways never seen in the modern era. On top of that, showing him there, covered or surrounded by gold. This is the editorial stance of what in the United States is called liberalism, aligned with the Democratic side. By the way, some updates on the tanker Vela, currently being pursued by the United States.
Sobre el petrolero Vela, en este momento perseguido por Estados Unidos, el petrolero Vela 1 se dirigía a Venezuela para recoger petróleo.
The oil tanker Vela 1 was heading to Venezuela to pick up oil and was not carrying any cargo, according to one of the officials consulted. When US forces approached the Vela 1, the ship refused to be boarded and continued sailing, one of the officers said. This was also reported by the New York Times as breaking news. A second officer described the situation as an active pursuit. The Coast Guard had successfully boarded the tanker on December 10th, so in this case, they have not even been able to board the vessel. They are apparently just accompanying it. Well, at some point they will carry out the boarding, but that is the current situation. If there are any new updates, we will present them. In the meantime, Fernando, perhaps we could start with the second topic.
Mientras tanto, Fernando, podríamos quizás comenzar con el segundo tema de
Sí, no, aprovecho este coitus interruptus, digo, perdón.
Yes, I'll take advantage of this coitus interruptus. I mean, sorry, this exchange, well, this jumping from one topic to another, to slip in some nonsense about the Europeans, just as a transition. I'm not saying this in connection with Politico, that, how should I put it? That publication known for its absolute rigor, for its extraordinary impartiality. I mention it because, well, I'm sure you've seen it on the channel. The statements by the Belgian Prime Minister are precisely in reference to a headline that Politico ran, saying that the Prime Minister and Belgium were Russia's most valuable asset. And then the man, very funny, after a bit of back and forth with the people from Politico, says, come on, go ahead and ask your question and all that. And he ends up saying, what headline would you come up with next? Well, I'm going to Maracha, near St. Petersburg, to visit my neighbors Gérard Depardieu and Basile Lassatte. I think I'll manage to become the mayor of that town. That'll be the headline of your next article.
There you have it. It was really funny. We were presenting it here on Friday.
It was very funny. Nothing suspicious about this man because he's a globalist.
I'm going to my dacha in St. Petersburg. My neighbor is Depardieu, and Assad lives across the street.
Sure, having a barbecue. Well, that's where we are, right? I say this because even his own supporters end up treating him like an idiot. I'll jump in here while you get that ready. I didn't want to miss the chance to mention the great, the fantastic Mers, who, of course, never fails to mess up and badly. So what has Mers told us lately? Well, you've probably already seen it. Mers goes and says, we support the Iranian government in its fight against terrorism. And I want to make this perfectly clear. If we and others had not provided military support to the State of Israel over the past decades, the State of Israel would not exist today.
Durante las últimas décadas, el Estado de Israel no existiría hoy. Digo, este tío es más tonto no puede ser.
I mean, this guy couldn't be any dumber. I mean, he's basically admitting that the State of Israel has been able to commit the atrocities it has committed and continues to commit, thanks to the support it has received from, among others, Germany. If Germany hadn't given that support, Merz says, the government would have collapsed. So he's basically labeling himself an accomplice to the massacre. You have to be stupid, really stupid, unbelievably stupid. This man is very stupid. But anyway, let's move on to the fools. I didn't want to skip mentioning this good man, another one, this Frenchman, just so they don't get upset, because you know how the French complain. I suppose you've already mentioned it. The French foreign minister, Jean Noël, mispronounced, who said the following: in Ukraine, Russia is suffering a political, military, and economic defeat. Brilliant. That's like being in the Andromeda Galaxy. No, even farther away. We should start it off like the beginning of Star Wars, the first movie ever made, right? A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, the French foreign minister Jean Noël said, in Ukraine, Russia, why say this at this point? Well, the guy went on to say, we're going all in. Their advance on the front is minimal, almost microscopic. Today, Europeans have decided to take their destiny into their own hands, speaking about the failed summit on the seizure of Russian assets, which in the end were not seized, even though that was their intention. They say, we have made important decisions to deprive Russia of access to its assets located in Europe for as long as necessary, until Vladimir Putin's Russia ends its aggressive war and pays reparations to Ukraine. This man, I mean, this is already something for a psychiatrist, seriously. And then also with the French politician Pierre Le Chouet, Hispanicized as Le Chouet, said the following, according to this guy.
Afirmó lo siguiente, dice este tipo. Para nosotros los europeos, y esto es precisamente.
For us Europeans, and this is precisely what explains the total panic of European governments, the problem is that they simply don't know how to act independently from the Americans. For 80 years, they've known that the United States provides them with support. The immediate question that arises is, how do we finance the war in Ukraine? In France and in other countries, we believe the war must go on. As the President of the Republic says, the military effort must continue. It's just not us who are dying, it's the Ukrainians who are. But hey, still, we must keep up the military effort. Well, whatever. I mean, why bother pretending otherwise?
All these people are surely readers of that British publication Express, here translated by El Navegador. That's the original.
So that the level of chaos, both mental and otherwise, among Europeans can be seen.
Putin's desperate troops are so short on food that they're eating each other in Ukraine. Oh. The Russian forces have resorted to cannibalism.
To cannibalism.
Oh. Even within the level of craziness of these people, this is already on another level, isn't it?
This already has an exquisite touch, even gastronomically exquisite. Cannibalism, I mean. No, you have to send this to me when the show ends, don't forget to frame it, right? So the grandchildren can see it someday and say, look, the things they used to say.
Well, this is the level of madness. Our next topic is the attacks launched by Russia about a week ago, if I remember correctly, on Saturday the 13th, against the southern region of Odessa, here in the east, the oblast or region of Odessa, divided in two by the Dniester estuary, with the capital being the city of Odessa. The attacks initially focused on the capital city of Odessa, its critical energy and transportation infrastructure. The new development involved ships and ports. I remember that together we reported on the attack on a ferry, a vehicle transport ship that was carrying diesel engines at the time. But in recent days, we've been able to determine that the Russians have begun attacking the bridges that connect the northern region with the southern one. And today, new attacks in that same direction.
Y el día de hoy, nuevos ataques en este sentido. Atención aquí.
Así es.
Otra vez contra.
Attention here. Once again, an attack on the Mayaki Bridge, a very important bridge for connecting not only cars, but also, if I remember correctly, trains with the rest of Ukraine, particularly with Odessa, but above all with the port of Reni. On one side Ukraine, on the other Romania. It's a Danube port, and therefore the point of reception not only for NATO weapons, but above all for 60% of the fuel consumed in Ukraine. Here are the images. We'll show them. And then I'd like your analysis, Fernando. Once again, this bridge is being attacked. A few days ago, there were also attacks. If we go back here, they'll appear in a video. 15 of them. Yes, 15 attacks on that other bridge in Satoka, further down.
Esto en Satoka, más abajo.
Sí, efectivamente.
Fernando, ¿qué quiere?
Yes, exactly. Fernando, what do you mean?
Las vigas, seguramente de acero. Lo digo porque esto.
I mention it because of those Soviet bridges. I was presenting it, and it reminded me of you during the live broadcast, your comments about the strength of the bridges. With that same one I'm going to show now, Fernando.
Sí, mientras tanto, bueno, y contando, fijaros en el vídeo.
Yes, meanwhile, well, and counting. Look at the video. Bombs are falling, bunker buster bombs, they're falling. There we have it. Look there, you can see it clearly in the first crater, especially in the second one. There we can already see how the surface layer has been destroyed, meaning the asphalt and so on. The reinforced concrete has also been destroyed, but look, the beams have barely moved. They've hardly even lost their paint. That is, you can see a whitish color and so on, probably flaking from age, not from the impact. This means these are very solid bridges because the Soviet Union built them precisely for this purpose, to withstand bombings. Let's not forget that back in the Cold War era, this was a high-risk area.
Estábamos justamente en una zona, digamos, de alto riesgo. No estamos en Vladivostok, que está al otro lado de Rusia. Estamos en Ucrania.
We're not in Vladivostok, which is on the other side of Russia. We're in Ukraine, which used to belong to the Soviet Union and is relatively close to the front, and of course within range of bombings in a war with NATO in Europe. In other words, they're holding out a lot. That's why right now we're seeing a kind of race between the Russians and the Ukrainians. The Russians trying to keep bombing and destroying this bridge, and the other one. What's the other one called? The one in Satoka. Satoka is on one end and this one on the other, and the Ukrainians are trying to restore it. In fact, what they did with the cluster bomb the other day, when they apparently launched cluster munitions, is that it discourages or even kills the workers who are at that moment trying to reestablish communication and rebuild the bridge. There's a tremendous race going on right now in that regard, which the Russians are obviously winning, as they've already practically, at least from what I've last read, cut off communications in that area of Odessa. This area, which is more or less to the south, the southwest of Odessa right now, that is from Odessa's main port. But as you rightly pointed out, there are two ports, Reni and Ismail, or something like that. I'll tell you in a moment because I always forget. Here, in the video behind you, Fernando, the 15 drones, if I remember correctly, it was precisely on December 15th, falling one after another, of course, one after another over that other bridge. Well, that's what I was telling you. These bridges are over the mouth of the Dniester, another of the great rivers of Ukraine and Europe, and the port, that is, the two Danube ports that are key. Let's not forget that on the other side of the Danube is Romania, a NATO country. Ismail and Reni. These two ports would be completely isolated, unable to transport anything through their roads, already in Ukrainian territory, crossing these two Dniester bridges to reach other areas of Ukraine. In other words, they would necessarily have to take a huge detour, going through Moldova, which isn't particularly easy either. Because if we look at the map of Moldova, which is right next door, we'll see that the Transnistria region, that is, the part controlled by the Russians, takes up most of it, and there's only a small area they could go through, with all the problems that implies. That means the trucks and all kinds of transport heading toward Ukraine. And this is important because, as even Ukrainian media are acknowledging, roughly 60% of the fuel, that is, diesel, gas oil, and gasoline that goes into Ukraine, comes from this area. In other words, it doesn't come from Poland, it comes from here. So we have a problem. That's why the Russians are doing this. They're destroying Ukraine's ability to supply petroleum products that come from NATO countries, mainly through Romania, although they also come from many other places. This is key. They had previously bombed the ports of Reni and Ismail, but now they've decided to attack something that is, so to speak, easier to cut off, as you rightly point out, these two bridges. From there, the Ukrainians tried to build a pontoon bridge, but the Russians attacked that too. And of course, pontoon bridges are inherently weak. In other words, these aren't the Soviet bridges the Russians are bombing. A pontoon bridge, whether Ukrainian, Russian, American, or Martian, is relatively easy to destroy, to sink.
In recent days, there have also been attacks here in Zatoka. This is precisely the point of convergence between the M15 highway coming from the Mayaki Bridge and the railway line that comes from the Zatoka Bridge. Both meet there, clearly visible, one above and the other below.
Down below, crystal clear.
And Reni. Here, another bridge that was attacked the other day. You can see it very clearly there. In another video from the previous day, If I remember correctly, it's even clearer.
Clearer now. But anyway, you can see the Garen's attack, how it hits the Garen.
This that we present.
Well, now the Garen's attack will be clearly seen.
The million-dollar question. Is Russia, so to speak, merely trying to create a fuel supply problem and, naturally, also a shortage of military equipment coming through the port of Rainy and the port of Ismail via Germany, a NATO country? Or could Russia be preparing an amphibious offensive in response to the isolation of this entire southern region of Odessa province, or the Odessa region, cut off from the north, supported by? According to Ukrainian intelligence, the Transnistria region has reportedly begun recruiting military support personnel, not soldiers, but support staff in Transnistria, and the Russians are said to have also started drone production in this area. Could they be creating the conditions for a landing in this region, Fernando? No.
Por supuesto que pueden estar, y de hecho las están generando.
Of course they can be, in fact they are generating them. Another matter is whether they actually do it, and if they do, when will they do it? That is to say, both things are, let's say, complementary. They're part of a stage. Indeed, they are following the same line we've been seeing since the summer or since spring-summer. That is, they are de-energizing Ukraine. Let's not forget that, although the most important part is the electrical one, they have been constantly attacking oil refineries, gas storage areas, and so on. Other energy sources have also been hit hard. So that's the work being carried out by the Russians. Now then, indeed, there's a danger that has existed practically since the beginning of the war, of the so-called special military operation. There have been moments when there were, let's say, contacts, some drones, things like that, as if the police were playing tricks on you, as if the ASD.
You can see the sound there. There, the sound has stopped. Yes, I can hear it.
There it falls. No, this is what I was saying before. There we see the other one. A small bridge, let's say, to cross a stream. You can rebuild it quickly, or the railway line even faster. But if you're being bombed every day, you don't have time. There we have an image of this smaller bridge. So in the end, Russian capability ends up outweighing the Ukrainians' ability to restore or rebuild these bridges or railway lines. But this, as you were saying, is very important because, indeed, on the one hand, it's another element of that process of draining Ukraine's energy. Here we have to refer to Putin's well-known statements when, with the so-called Shadow Fleet in the Black Sea, 2 ships from that Russian Shadow Fleet were bombed. And then Putin says, well, let's see, here we'll have 3 levels. First, intensify the attacks, bombings, and so on over the port of Odessa and its surroundings. All of this is part, let's say, of the Odessa complex, so to speak, the Odessa area, even if it's not strictly the port itself. And well, the second stage, he said, let's see if they get more stubborn and keep attacking Russian ships or oil tankers and so on, then the time will come when we'll start attacking foreign ships, meaning European ships, that is, from NATO or the European Union. And he already said in the end, and if things keep escalating, then we'll go further, and indeed what we'll do is block the port of Odessa and its surroundings. In other words, nothing will come in here, zero.
Aquí ya no va a entrar nada, cero. En ese contexto es en el que podría darse.
In that context, that's what could happen. Those operations you mentioned, let's say, amphibious ones. That is, if you block off this whole area and nothing happens here, before a massive attack against all the British and others who are there, launching maritime drones and attacking Crimea from Odessa, from this entire region, if there's a very intense preparation, with an area you've already isolated, and where it would be easier for you to enter. And let's not forget that Odessa is a large, important city. Well, then this could be a staging area for a possible landing in the future, in case the Russian leadership decided that a total blockade of this area was necessary. No one passes through here. We control this entire part of the sea. And well, it could be a preparation.
Bueno, puede ser una preparación. Desde luego, yo no creo que esto se hiciera, si se hace.
Of course, I don't think this would be done, if it's done at all, before the spring or summer of next year, assuming it actually happens. Obviously, from now until then, let's not forget that we're in, well, now technically in the second day, but still, the first day of winter. We're still on the first day of winter, which is the 21st in this case. That is December 21st. Yes, winter has just begun. We have 3 months of winter ahead until the 21st or 22nd of March, depending. Now, this whole policy of wrecking the energy system, further collapsing the Zaporizhia front, the Zaporizhia sector, and so on, will continue. But this, indeed, is, or could be, the prelude to a possible amphibious landing operation, once the decision is made to impose a total blockade of the port of Odessa, so that not even a little fish can get through. But it wouldn't be something immediate.
Technical question. Yes, obviously this would be for 2026.
No, and 2026 at the earliest, in the summer. That is, in the best-case scenario. Let's see, all of this depends on how the triple crisis we've always talked about evolves. Political, with the issue of corruption; military, mainly concerning Zaporizhia, the Zaporizhia sector; and energy-related, with the loss of power during the winter. Many things could happen. We'll see.
If Putin ultimately decides to carry out an amphibious operation in that region, what differences would that operation have compared to the completely failed, ruined, destroyed Ukrainian amphibious operation in Krinky? Do you remember it, Fernando? Yes. Look, the big novelty of this war is the massive emergence of drones, and therefore the constant real-time monitoring of the battlefield. How could this amphibious operation respond to that new challenge, the possibility of detection and interception of amphibious vehicles by maritime or aerial drones, above all? What would the differences be, in your opinion, Fernando?
¿Cuáles las diferencias, Fernando, en tu opinión?
Bueno, total, estamos hablando de un río que por muy grande que sea.
Well, Dr. Tala, we're talking about a river that, no matter how big it is, also had many islands. Let's not forget that this allows you to jump from island to island, from one shore to the other. This is a river operation, even if it's large. I mean, very wide in that area, in the case of Krinky and so on. But anyway, this would have nothing to do with an operation of enormous magnitude like this one. Look, amphibious landing operations are among the hardest things one can do in war. In fact, let's remember the most famous one in history, the Normandy landing. It went well by sheer luck, pure luck, really. Because, well, without going into too much detail, there were a number of German units that were supposed to move to a certain place, be in a certain place, and they weren't, especially the armored ones. Even so, the Normandy landing, which had, if I remember correctly, I'm speaking from memory here, the beach area, and not much more. That is, once the beaches were taken, which happened on the first day, the following days they were stuck around Cherbourg and nearby areas for over a month without moving out. The terrain worked against them. In other words, it took them an eternity to advance. If I remember correctly, about 3 months. Until they finally left Brittany and so on, they began, and that was with 500,000 troops landing. Well, a bit fewer, but still more than 500,000 took part. Anyway, in the famous Normandy landing. Why? Because amphibious operations are extremely complex. Here we're talking about, even if it's not too far, having to cross from Crimea, from other areas coming from Varazov, from Russian ports and so on. They would have to establish a blockade. They would need complete control of the sea and the air. And here comes a problem they didn't have in Normandy: drones. That is to say, they would have to practically eliminate, never completely, but minimize as much as possible, the ability to launch drones against the fleet and against the soldiers who would be landing on the Ukrainian side. Then there would have to be a tremendous punishment. Be careful with what they might do. And one of the things we'll see right now, what I was saying before, that I lost my train of thought as always, went off in another direction, is that watch out, because since the beginning of the war, the Ukrainians have been talking about a possible joint operation and so on, but mainly a Ukrainian one, meaning with Ukrainian troops, to take Transnistria. That is to say, Moldovans and Ukrainians would take Transnistria. This would be an absolute provocation that would lead the Russians to quickly increase the intensity of the war and to move, let's say, more resources. We would then see what kind of resources. The reason it hasn't been done is that the Ukrainians are afraid to launch an operation against Transnistria, since the consequences could be, to put it plainly, very harsh. In other words, the so-called surgical operation that Putin talked about might stop being so surgical and become much harsher. So all of that has to be taken into account. An amphibious operation is very complicated. That is, Russia would already need to have control over that entire region and even have conquered some additional areas. For example, having advanced to the other side in Kherson and practically taken the part of Kherson that is in Ukrainian hands. You need absolute control to carry out a large landing operation. A different matter is, and this they can indeed do without major problems, well, without major problems considering the nature of these operations, using the Spetsnaz. Spetsnaz is the general designation for Russian Special Operations Forces. To send them, and they're probably doing it because obviously these things aren't talked about. Sending small special operations units to carry out a specific task and then they come back. That, yes, that they can do, and they're probably doing it. But as I said, these things aren't made public. These special operations forces can go destroy a specific target, that's true. But to carry out an amphibious landing of any significant scale, crossing the sea, as I said, you need to have almost complete or very nearly absolute control of the sea and the air. And right now the sea, well, maybe, but the problem would be those Ukrainian drones. So before that, you'd have to have already heavily decimated the Ukrainian army. But look, as was rightly pointed out, you can see it here. If the Russians take Kherson, the part that's in Ukrainian hands, well then they're already getting closer to this area of Odessa and Transnistria. We have Mykolaiv in between, but let's not forget that at the beginning of the war in 2022, the Russians, before they withdrew, reached Mykolaiv. Mykolaiv was semi-encircled. That is, the entire area east of the city was surrounded by the Russians. To me, this was a mistake. I think the Russians were slow there and should have taken advantage of the advantages they had in that sector to push forward, as I'm going to show here, Ezekiel, to at least advance and put Odessa in a more dangerous situation. As I said, Odessa is a large city and also a pro-Russian or Russian-speaking one, so the Russians aren't going to punish it too harshly, beyond what's strictly necessary. That is, what are they doing now? Let's not forget, as I mentioned on Friday, that there have already been protests in Odessa, long lines of cars and so on, protesting against the power outages. People in Odessa are having a really hard time. There are many hours a day when they have no electricity. Well, Odessa is one of the places where next year we might see a certain rebellion among the European population against the disastrous situation Ukraine will fall into this winter. Because they're already doing it. That is, the first signs of protest are already emerging among the population in the face of a very harsh situation without electricity. So that's why I say many things could happen. If the sector that's collapsing now, precisely in this direction, Zaporizhia, Dnipro, Petrovsk, and so on, keeps collapsing further, and at the same time rebellions, uprisings, and so on start breaking out in this Odessa area, which is pro-Russian, Russian-speaking, well, that would make things easier. If the Russians advance on Kherson, that would obviously make it easier for them to move forward in this area, forcing the Ukrainians to make a choice. Of course, the Ukrainians would defend Odessa at all costs. It's their only access to the sea. If the Russians take Odessa, it's over. I mean, not just the war would be over, but a more or less viable Ukrainian state would also be finished. Without access to the sea, that's the end.
Sin salida al mar, esto es lo último. Es decir, entonces aquí los ucranianos iban a poner toda la carne.
So here the Ukrainians were going to give it their all, and well, we'll have to see. As I said, the key here will be how Ukraine gets through the winter and what shape it's in afterward. Let's not forget that Putin has already, maliciously, said something he knows can't be fulfilled. But anyway, in line with Trump, he's already said something like, no, we're willing, well, not just willing, we're forcing the Ukrainians to hold elections. Because with this man, with Zelensky, who's no longer president, we can't sign anything. So if you want serious negotiations and all that, hold elections first. We even look when the elections are ready and all that, whatever, we'd stop during the elections and so on, and we wouldn't compare it. This is pure rhetoric, you know that, right?
Esto es pura retórica, saben que no, nada de esto va a suceder, por eso lo dice. Pero quiero decir, ya está metiéndole.
None of this is going to happen. That's why they say it. But I mean, they're already putting pressure by saying, well, right now there's nothing to negotiate with a man who is an illegitimate or illegal president from the standpoint of Ukrainian law itself. Hold elections and then we could negotiate. In other words, hold elections that will take you months to organize at best. And when you finally have them, which you won't, or at least not while Zelensky is in power, then there will be nothing left to negotiate, because you'll see, you'll have practically surrendered unconditionally. I mean, they're dragging things out so that this winter becomes decisive in destroying Ukraine's defensive capabilities in every area. So that's what it will be. When we get to the end of March, we'll have to see what the situation looks like.
Fernando, sí.
Fernando, yes. A question based on military imagination or fantasy. This whole situation would look completely different if Russia were to deploy a much larger number of troops in Transnistria than it currently has. According to estimates, there are about 2,000 troops, mostly in Tiraspol. Of those 2,000, apparently 1,000 are Russians with Russian passports, brought from Russia, and 1,000 are local Moldovans.
Locales, sí.
Locales. Si Rusia pudiera generar en Transnistria una conglomeración.
If Russia were able to deploy a force of 10,000 troops in Transnistria, wouldn't that create a completely different context, a completely different situation? Because they could, for example, launch an attack toward Odessa from the rear. They could also carry out a blockade, precisely to counter this breakthrough achieved here through the destruction of the bridges. Well, in some way, they could secure and consolidate that situation. They could also support a landing operation, not only with air and drone assistance, but also in some way with ground forces. Many, many possibilities would open up.
Muchas posibilidades abiertas. Los rusos los rusos no pueden realizar envíos de material por medio.
The Russians cannot send supplies through Transnistria's airspace, which is blocked by Moldova. But with an open imagination, with a bit of fantasy, the Russians could send more personnel there in different ways. If not through an airborne operation, perhaps by land through Moldova, in a way. So, what's the problem here?
A ver, ¿cuál es el problema aquí? ¿Cuál es el problema aquí?
What's the problem here? Well, there are many. Come on, there's one big one. According to the sources, there are between 1,500 and 2,000 Russian soldiers, including both Russians and local forces, let's say. Well, that's obviously not enough even to defend Transnistria if the Ukrainians decided to attack it. But this brings more issues. Because in the south of Transnistria, There's one of what used to be the largest weapons depots from the Soviet era in Europe. It's a huge depot, really huge, full of ammunition, artillery, and so on. It's not entirely clear. We're talking about quantities in the tens of thousands of almost everything, even hundreds of thousands. It's not known because this is a very old depot, and its current condition isn't well understood. In fact, what we do know is that out of those 1,500 or 2,000, quite a few, around 500 or so, were guarding that depot. I mean, we really don't know what's there, nor whether the Russians know exactly what's there either, because it's a depot that's been sitting there, basically abandoned, since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the conflict in Transnistria between the Russian side and the Moldovans in Moldova. But this is a very important depot, at least in principle. So important that at the beginning of the war, the Ukrainians actually considered that option. That is, attacking Transnistria would basically be to seize those weapons. So that's another factor. I mean, of course, if in some way there were more Russian troops there in Transnistria, say 10,000 soldiers, then we'd be talking about not needing to supposedly send weapons, because they would already have them. At least conventional weapons, right? Artillery, ammunition, and so on. Armored vehicles, tanks. But that's a big unknown. However, right now, the only thing I see is this. The Ukrainians' desperation might drive them to carry out an operation to seize that weapons depot in a last-ditch effort. That really would lead to some kind of Russian intervention, but right now it's very difficult for them, because they can't even send soldiers, since all the airspace around Transnistria is either Moldovan or Ukrainian. In other words, there's nothing else, so they're surrounded, so to speak. Well, at this point, I see a greater possibility that, at some desperate moment, NATO, especially the European NATO, since the United States is focused on other things, together with the Europeans, Ukrainians, and Moldovans, might decide to carry out some kind of operation in Transnistria as a desperate provocation, and also to take control of that weapons depot and trigger an inevitable and extremely harsh Russian reaction. Could be, huh? The British are desperate. The last thing I've been able to read about this is that behind all these operations involving Russian oil tankers, the surprise and all that, who's behind it? Well, you can imagine, the British, basically the British. That is, let's not forget that the British have a completely different agenda from Trump's. In fact, it's not just different, it's the opposite. Trump wants to pull out of Ukraine and leave the mess, literally, to the Europeans, while the British want to create a major war in Europe. And not just any war, one that goes far beyond Ukraine.
I wanted Fernando to pinpoint on the map exactly where that Soviet arsenal is. Let me see if I remember the name, Kolbasna, I think it was. But I can't locate the place on the map.
Let's see, it's a small idea. Maybe it's not even a good one.
That's why not. From what I've found out here, it's northeast of Tiraspol, but I couldn't determine exactly well how.
Let's see, I'm looking here. It really wouldn't help me for... It's quite far south, huh? I remember it's pretty far south. You know, Transnistria is a narrow, elongated strip. Tiraspol is there, more toward the south. Well, this would be even farther south than Tiraspol.
No, Fernando, here.
Up there, look, a bit higher. I was mistaken, Kolbasna. Well, there's a settlement here, and that's where the depot is. It's not the same settlement, it's next to it, but it's an underground depot. Here. A depot that is basically underground.
With its own train station, obviously, for shipping weapons, right, to anywhere else.
Of course, that's the idea. We don't know what condition they're in, because they haven't been touched since the Soviet Union era. But now I'm saying the available data indicates that it was one of the largest weapons depots the Soviets had there, and that it's still there, practically untouched. And in fact, as I said, there's a garrison of about 1,500 to 2,000 soldiers permanently stationed at the gates of that depot, guarding it just in case something happens, because the Ukrainians might decide to do something. As I said, there was a moment at the beginning of the war when there were a series of unknown drone attacks, in quotes, flying around there and so on, and it seemed like the Ukrainians were testing the waters to see how each side would react and whether an attack to capture it might be possible.
The thing is, it's nothing.
Adelante, Fernando, adelante.
Yes, go ahead, Fernando, go ahead. No, it all came to nothing. There were those attacks, they stopped, there were only a few, and it didn't go any further. There were no more attacks or threats with drones of that kind.
One of the problems with an operation of this kind, Fernando, happens to be marked on the map by chance, but rightly so, over the Black Sea here.
Yes.
Todo el tiempo, como esto aguas internacionales.
All the time it's like this. International waters and international airspace. There are always US planes flying around here, monitoring everything. Above all, drones, like this one, for example. Black Hawk, Global Hawk.
Global Hawk.
Global Hawk,
no, pero estará incluso aviones norteamericanos como los Poseidón también.
No, but there are even American planes, like the Poseidons there as well. I mean, everything is there, all kinds of things. Right now, there isn't a single day when there aren't 7, 8, 10 of those planes flying around constantly. What I mean is that the area is saturated. Let's not forget that, in addition, although the Americans, like other NATO countries not bordering the Black Sea, have not been able to send military vessels through the Bosporus Strait since the start of the special military operation, because the guarantors of the treaty, let me see if I remember, of Montreux, that is, the Montreux Convention, state that in cases of military operations or wars, only the countries bordering the Black Sea can participate, and that no military ship may enter the Black Sea. In fact, even in times of peace, foreign military ships, and that was seen many times before the special military operation, could only stay for 21 days. After 21 days, they had to leave. Then another one could enter, or the same one, but it had to leave. At that point, Turkey, since the start of the special military operation, said, no one passes through here, not a single one. And in fact, that's the reason why we don't have any British, American, or French ships. But even if it seems minor, let's not forget that Bulgaria and Romania are in NATO. Well, Turkey too, although I think Turkey wouldn't get involved in this mess. But they do have warships.
It's incredible, Fernando, how warfare has been transformed by drones, because without the massive presence of drones, even in Ukraine's hands, Russia could, rather than launching a quick and surprise amphibious operation, simply send its entire Black Sea fleet here, establish a blockade, and then begin a landing under much more favorable conditions, after continuous attacks from the Russian fleet along the southern coast of the Odessa region. That obviously can't be the case. Ships can't leave this place because of the danger that a small, low-cost Ukrainian maritime drone could cause the destruction of a large Russian vessel. This doesn't apply only to Russian ships. On a global scale, any ship today is basically a kind of target. The Houthis managed to strike at US carrier groups off their coasts. The Houthis, one of the poorest peoples in the world. Wouldn't the Ukrainians be able to do the same with NATO's support? Logically.
Claro, no. El factor sorpresa no existe. Quiero decir, o sea, ya no existe.
Of course not. The element of surprise doesn't exist. With drones, and on top of that, all the intelligence NATO has, it's impossible. But what they do, even if they're detected, is that when they want to launch, for example, caliber missiles from Russian ships in the Black Sea, from the Black Sea Fleet, They go out, launch them, and then go back in. They obviously don't launch them from the ports. They're detected, but, well, on some channels, on Telegram, we can follow everything perfectly, because we're talking about so-called open channels, not official ones, or anything like that.
Yes, open source, from open sources, from open sources.
People dedicated to that. Yes. And perfectly at night we sit down and can see what they're telling us. For example, 3 Tu-95 strategic bombers are moving from one base to another, getting into launch position to then go and launch. And they tell you at this moment 3 caliber missiles are flying, for example. That is, they'll take this long to reach their supposed targets. And they're right. We see this every night on certain channels. That is, if open sources are able to predict more or less. Although it's true that since missiles and drones change course and do so often, they may seem to be heading for one target and then go to a different one. Well, if we can see this in open sources, just imagine what the Americans can see with all their satellites, planes, drones, and so on, spread across the region. They can see even the movement of a fly and predict the movement of that fly. Just think about it. Things are such that even the Russians, taking advantage of the fact that they have a sea that isn't really a sea, well, the Caspian Sea, have lately also been using, this isn't the first time they've done it, corvettes. There's something called the Caspian Flotilla. Obviously, they have very few ships there, and since it's a lake and you can't go anywhere, what they have are small ships, corvette type, large patrol boats, just to give an idea, but armed. And these corvettes are equipped with Caliber missiles. In fact, they've launched Caliber missiles from the Caspian in recent times, for example. There, even if they see it, they say, here they definitely can't send us maritime drones, that's for sure. And the others, well, they might reach, but not in time. In other words, the situational awareness of the war today, of the battlefield, is absolute on the part of the major powers. They know the opponent's movements perfectly, down to the smallest detail, almost man by man. Well, actually, not even almost. In that sense, since the element of surprise has completely disappeared, we're now dealing with a different kind of movement. For example, one of the things we won't see again, at least for a long time, until there's another shift in warfare, are deep attacks. Forget it. Those can only be done in very asymmetric wars against people who have nothing. But now, even in the poorest countries, they'll have enough drones to hurt you. So, deep attacks, we can forget about them. What we used to see, large tank units charging in World War II and doing things like the Battle of Kursk, a Battle of Kursk like the one in World War II, we're not going to see that again. Let's forget about it. That's history. Or those supposed great tank battles that might have taken place in Europe if the Americans and NATO had faced the Warsaw Pact during the Cold War. With about 60,000 tanks the Soviets had, that's gone. For now, the development of countermeasures.
When they develop lasers against drones, or protective bubbles, or deployable nets, or some other invention of the human mind, as happened after the development of the tank, you'll remember, Fernando, in the early 20th century, a change in warfare took place. It seemed indestructible until defensive forces developed the ability to counter the tank. And from then on it became possible once again to stop these new. But here we enter. Sooner or later too.
But for now, what we're seeing, and obviously this will probably change, but for now what we're seeing is that the race between the shield and the sword, so to speak, that is, between the attack systems of drones, which are very cheap, let's not forget, extremely cheap depending on the type of drone, but still mass-produced and capable of creating saturation situations whenever they want. Right now, this is wiping out every possible defensive option. There's no way to stop it, at least for the moment. We'll see in the future. But of course, notice what we mentioned the other day. In the case of many Ukrainian units, the Russian ones are a bit behind. 80% of supplies are already being delivered on the front line, within the last 5 or 10 kilometers. 80% of food supplies, ammunition, evacuation of the wounded, and so on are being carried out with drones, both ground and aerial. In fact, it was said the other day, I don't remember if it was Gerasimov or Belousov, the Russian defense minister, that they were a bit behind the Baba Yaga. What are the Baba Yaga? The Baba Yaga, which even sound like something out of Star Wars, no, they have nothing to do with the Star Wars movies, are big drones with about 8 rotors. Instead of quadcopters, they're octocopters or more, meaning since they have more power, they're mainly used to carry loads and handle logistics transport. And then they're also developing more and more. At first they were kind of a joke. I mean, a joke because they'd break down and all that. Ground drones, that is. Ones with wheels or, more often, tracks that move things around and transport stuff.
I've also seen it used for attacks, right?
Yeah.
The Baba Yaga also attack, basically throwing or dropping grenades or bombs.
It's a heavy drone. It's designed for the combat zone. It's not a long-range drone capable of traveling 1,000 kilometers. No, it's a drone for that area. But the Russians were just saying they needed this kind of drone, that they were behind schedule, and that Putin pushed them, saying you have to develop this because logistics are already impossible unless it's done this way.
It is a Ukrainian technology, a Ukrainian development.
But really, just look at how things are. That's why when you hear those disgraceful, useless, inept, incompetent, ignorant people, I'm running out of adjectives here, the Europeans, you just think, come on, gentlemen, you deserve to be put before a metaphorical firing squad. Metaphorical, so we don't get into trouble, metaphorically speaking. Why? Because they say this kind of thing every single day. Right now, it's the Ukrainians who are teaching the Europeans how to handle drones and fight drone wars. In other words, they haven't got a clue, not the slightest idea. They have no idea.
And not just the Europeans, my dear.
No, yeah. Right now, the Americans, with great fanfare, have released images and all that because they've already launched, it's already up and running and everything. A drone, I can't remember what it's called. That's a Shahed, I'd say.
Having seen the videos from years of irony and contempt from Americans, military analysts and experts about Iranian drones, that low-quality junk, that cheap stuff, now copied.
Yeah, but come on.
Totally, but to the letter. Like the Chinese, by the way. And then supposedly the Chinese are the copycats, right?
Of course, what I'm saying is the Chinese copy us. Man, they're copying us right here.
Images related to this, courtesy of our friendly and sister channel, Wars and Geopolitics.
Great channel, follow it.
Here, indeed, everyone is invited to subscribe on Telegram. Naturally, these images are from yesterday. A drone in the skies over Kiev, flying around the city and staying up there for quite a while, until someone finally shot it down. It was carrying a Russian flag and stayed there for quite some time. This is just a video of the final part, but that drone was up there for a long time, and the Ukrainians in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, yes, right in the center, well, that drone was up there for quite a while. What are you going to launch?
¿Qué vas a lanzar? ¿Un Patriot contra esto? Pues no, evidentemente.
A Patriot against that. Well, no, obviously that's a waste. I mean, the Patriot, each missile, I don't even remember exactly, but it costs over $1 million. And these quadcopter drones, what do they cost? 200 euros, or 300, or 500 at most. I mean, you can just buy them. You go on AliExpress or Amazon, and you can get them, right? In fact, both in Ukraine and in Russia, there are tons of channels, we can see them, run by Russians. I guess they're saying, come on, make a donation or something to buy a drone and send it to such and such unit. Why? And they send it? I mean, they take care of it later, they buy it on Amazon or wherever, and then they handle the small modification to attach a grenade underneath. That is to say, anyone, for example, who goes on Amazon, I mention Amazon because it's easier in the West, or on AliExpress or any of those sites, and looks up those small drones, can get whatever they want. If you want to check prices, they're laughable. By the way, supposedly it's already operational, although you never really know until the time comes. I can't remember the name, but we mentioned it here, that Chinese drone, a drone carrier that could carry 100 mini drones and release them. And well, everything suggests it's already operational. Images have been seen at exhibitions, meaning not flying. That famous video where they're shown releasing drones.
El famoso vídeo este donde salen echando drones, pues imagínate estos portadrones que...
Well, imagine these drone carriers that instead of one carrying 100, carry 20. Now multiply that by 100. I mean, the ones that release them. This is unstoppable. Not even electronic warfare. Well, look, one of the few things that actually works is the fiber optics. On Friday, we showed a video, I'm sure you showed it too, of a field in Le Mans. Well, the video starts with, it's just spectacular. It begins with a kind of field that looks like a sea, and then it reaches a road, some houses, and it's amazing because they made the video so that the sunlight reflects off the web. And at first you see it and it looks like a calm sea. Can I send it to you? I have it right here.
Yeah, I honestly haven't seen that.
I'll send it to you right now, because even though it will be...
Fernando, the Ukrainian instructors for drone operations are not only indoctrinating the European and US armed forces, but also criminal organizations all over the world. That's why drone operators have been found.
With jihadists, yes.
With jihadists, with Mexican drug cartels, and even with drug cartels in Rio de Janeiro. This is a side effect of sending weapons and money to the warlords. We won't label them as neo-Nazis, but rather as Ukrainian nationalists, who have become warlords, developing into a kind of elite with a unique expertise in the world, shared only by the Russians. They travel around the world, marketing this to the highest bidder, usually organized crime groups. By the way, Fernando, a few final things. I'd like your comment.
Yeah, I think I sent you the video. Check and see just in case I send it to you again.
We already presented this before, Fernando. Yes, as I said, I'm a bit useless. This is Mr. Lukashenko. Quite a character, Lukashenko. Yes, indestructible. Yes, quite a character. For me, once again, I think I must have made this comparison before, because of his appearance, supposedly very tall, a guy about 2 meters tall and 120 kilos.
Yes. No, it's not small.
Yes, although the guy, obviously speaking in Belarusian, kind of reminds you of those characters from American police shows from the 1980s. The police chief with a suit stained with ketchup from a hot dog, right? Kind of rough, but very straightforward. It's a bit like that. Well, this is a speech he gave just a few days ago, in which, among other things, he officially announced the actual deployment and start of operation of the Oreshnik missiles in Belarus. It had already been mentioned as a project, but this time it was officially declared operational. What's the significance of this, Fernando Moragón, in Belarus?
Importancia de esto, Fernando, Oreshnik en Bielorrusia?
Absoluta, porque fíjate.
Absolutely, because look, let's first go through a very brief sequence. By the way, I've already sent you the video. You have it somewhere on Telegram. A brief sequence. In November of last year, the first Oreshnik was launched. This first Oreshnik probably carried one or more missiles, that is, they launched it to see how it would perform in the war, on the battlefield. From there, seeing that it worked perfectly, Putin in 2025 gave the order to start production. And now Lukashenko confirms, although it was already confirmed, that they are in Belarus.
Pero nos confirma Lukashenko de que están en Bielorrusia. Bien, dices, están en Bielorrusia. Claro, es que Bielorrusia.
Well, they say they're in Belarus. Of course, Belarus is closer to Russia, well, except for Kaliningrad, but it's also closer to the rest of Europe than Russia is. So, for example, we can clearly see what it would mean to launch an Oreshnik from Brest. Brest is a Belarusian city right next to Poland, very close to the border. So let me put it this way. How long it would take to reach certain places. For instance, Helsinki, 5 minutes. Because let's not forget that the Oreshnik is a hypersonic missile, about 9 or 10 times the speed of sound. To Vilna, or Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, 1 minute and 7 tenths. To Kyiv,
1,7 minutos. A Kiev.
The afternoon in Brest. We're showing the map to add just a bit more, not exactly spectacle.
Yes.
Sure, look, I'm telling you, here, Brest.
there, Brest. It's very close to the border with Poland.
Poland, basically zero, is nothing.
Right, I mean the Polish base that's roughly at the level of Danzig, the one the United States has on the coast, in the area near the sea. It's not here next to Brest, it's near the sea. So that gives you 2 minutes. You don't have time. A naval base, the missile defense system is placed here, what I have here, from the United States. But well, roughly 3.2 minutes.
If you don't have time, I mean only when, right, Danzig in...
What Danzig, yes.
Yes, here.
But as I was saying before, the capital of Lithuania, Vilnius or Vilna.
How long to Danzig again, Fernando? How long to Danzig?
3 minutes and 2 seconds. In other words, 3 minutes and 2 seconds.
3 minutes, 2 seconds. 002. Perfect, good.
But look, to Vilna or Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, which is right next door, 1 minute, 7 seconds. They don't even notice. I mean, 1 minute and 7 seconds.
1 minute and 7 seconds.
Helsinki, the capital of Finland, 5 minutes. We've got it up there.
There it is.
5 minutes.
I've lost Brest somewhere along the way. Now here, 5 minutes there.
From Brest, they could launch it from closer locations. To Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine. Yes, there, to the capital of Ukraine, 2 minutes, 7 seconds.
All right.
Imagine the Romanian base that the United States has in southern Romania, almost right next to the border with Bulgaria.
Well, Bucharest, more or less.
No, further south, right next to the border with Bulgaria. You go to the western part on the border between Bulgaria and around there. That is, from there it would take them 5 minutes and 5 seconds. And now comes the juicy part. 5 minutes and 5 seconds. And now comes the juicy part.
I'm sorry, Ezequiel, but here at the head of Mers on the map.
At the head of... No, better yet, to Ramstein, which is the information I have. Ramstein is farther than Berlin, right? It's near the border with the French. Ramstein, the famous gigantic American base. It's relatively close to Luxembourg, just so you get an idea, more or less where the border with France used to be.
Si no recuerdo mal, Ramstein ubicada en...
If I remember correctly, Ramstein, located in Bavaria, well, in Bavaria, of course, the largest of them all, but with that little corner there, already a bit above Baden-Württemberg, and indeed close to France.
Y cerca de, efectivamente, cerca de Francia.
Through Ramstein around there. Well, from Brest to Ramstein, 6 minutes, 1 second.
Neither, all this distance, neither. The ball.
That is to say, they don't get it. And now we're going, yes, and now we're not going to distant Paris anymore. That is to distant Paris. Paris, 8 minutes, 3 seconds.
Well, it's enough to make Macron change his suit.
If he does it quickly and his wife doesn't distract him by giving him a few slaps, well, all right, we'll see. Please, the distant and perfidious Albion to London.
8 minutes, 8 seconds.
8 minutos, 8 segundos. Bien.
Quiero decir, esto es imparable. Quiero decir, esto
8 minutes, 8 seconds.
En el momento que lo detectes,
Good.
te está cayendo.
I mean, this is unstoppable. It doesn't matter if you detect it, because the moment you detect it, it's already coming down on you. In other words, there's no reaction time at all. He said it, mind you, Zelensky said it the other day, and he's not exactly pro-Russian, right? Zelensky said, against a Kinzhal, there's nothing you can do. You can't do anything. You can't stop a Kinzhal. That's what Zelensky said, and this, well, this is great.
Esto es genial. Esto es genial.
This is great. He can't even handle the microphones at a press conference. This man can't handle the microphones at a press conference, let alone manage France.
Una rueda de prensa como para gestionar Francia. Es decir, no digamos ya una guerra.
That is to say, not to mention a war against Russia. These are our leaders. By the way, Merce is really angry because he's been betrayed now. Merce was all set. Come on, let's go with the Russians. And then Macron said, no, now we're going to talk with the Russians. So Merce got mad and said, no, not with the Russians. And Macron said, yes, we're going to talk. Things are looking really bad. But just look at that.
Putin's black hand with the microphones.
Man, everyone who was there at that moment with the microphones was Russian. That's clear.
It's obvious.
Seriously, this guy, you couldn't be more ridiculous. And there's plenty of competition for being ridiculous. Like Caja for example, who's another ridiculous one. The other day, Viktor Orban made fun of Caja saying something like, oh sure, so now it turns out Napoleon couldn't handle the Russians, neither could Fidel, but Caja is going to manage it, of course.
Bueno, Fernando, para redondear esta transmisión...
Well, Fernando, to wrap up this broadcast, something humorous, but also a bit more. By the way, remember to give us a like and subscribe. We reactivated memberships just recently, and we're also on TikTok, on Instagram. Our Instagram is very active now. Also on TikTok, Facebook, and so on. A little bit of, since it's this time of year, December 21st, soon the new, a touch of tenderness. Here's the representation of what we in Argentina call a nativity scene. In Spain, yes, it's the same here.
Belén, but you can also say manger.
In Colombia, what did they call it, Laura? They call it something else too, I can't remember now. Well, the idea is more or less clear. Here, the tenderness of a nativity scene.
Strongly European.
Pay attention to this. Brilliant. Artificial intelligence, obviously. But listen, dear Fernando, a nativity scene. Baby Jesus.
The little boy, he doesn't want to. He wants euros. He wants euros.
It's great. She wants euros, von der Leyen, of course. What do you have? Don't give her the bottle. Give her euros. The registered one, backwards. It's great. Well, let's see. Someday, since Europeans are so ridiculous, our leaders, someday it's going to be hard to tell these artificial intelligence videos from reality because they outdo themselves in making fools of themselves. So it's going to be very difficult.
But yes. Fernando, two last little things also about. Yes, can you help me? Where had we presented that? If I remember correctly, around here, just a second. No, I didn't have it ready. This, in fact, I presented it in one of my live broadcasts of Demolishing Myths Live a few days ago, which is on Norlix or someplace like that, Yakutia, minus 45 degrees. This cave filled. This lady, according to the translation, says, there's no bad weather, only bad clothing or bad attire.
Well, yes, in a certain sense.
Cars parked all night with the engine running, otherwise they freeze and won't start again. That's also why there's smog. Minus 45, I reported that a week ago. Today's news, this one here, dear Fernando. Minus 50. My goodness, people's faces frozen, right? Everyone covered up, and on their faces.
Congelada, ¿no? Todos cubiertos y en
Sí, claro, con las cejas, sí.
Yes, of course, with the eyebrows. Yes. Let's see. Look, I think I remember, though it's not that important, that one of the cities in Yakutia, in Sakha, which is a huge, gigantic republic in Russia that borders the Arctic and all that. I mean, it was enormous. In fact, you can't get there by road, only by plane, because trying to build a road that connects it is impossible. Even the smallest crack lets in water and ice, and it destroys it.
This slide, Fernando, if your pants are torn for some reason, the skin on your butt sticks to that frozen surface, and goodbye. The skin on your backside gets ripped off.
Arrancada la piel del culito.
Yeah, let's see. It gives me double chills because of that and because of the temperature.
Well, I think he holds the city record. One of them, not the capital, but one of those that holds the record. This guy delivering, obviously, food, like so many services, Glovo, Rappi, and so on a bicycle in the snow at minus 50 degrees. What madness.
Pero vamos a ver, lo que te decía es que el récord.
But let's see what I was telling you. The world record for the lowest temperature in an inhabited place is, I think, 71 below zero. 71 below zero, if I remember correctly. In fact, Yakutia is the place on Earth with the widest temperature range. You can get as low as 71 below zero in winter, but in summer it's not bad, it goes over 30. It doesn't last long, of course. So I think I remember it was a difference of 101 degrees or something like that. So it's crazy. I recommend that if people ever go there, it must be an amazing place. I haven't been. They should go in summer.
Where is that, Fernando? Where is that?
In Yakutia. Yakutia o Sakha.
Yakutia or Sakha. You can find it written both ways. If you look it up, from one extreme to the other, meaning if you take the highest recorded temperature in summer and the lowest recorded in winter, I think it was about 101 degrees of difference, because the highest recorded is in the 30s and the lowest is minus 71 degrees. So that's it's really crazy. It's true that their summer is very short, but it's also true that temperatures can go above 30 degrees in summer. Normally you might have maybe 20-something degrees or so, but I mean, this happens. The farthest north I've been in that area is Buryatia, at Lake Baikal. Just to give you an idea, in winter it's very cold at Lake Baikal. In fact, the lake freezes. And in summer, you can easily have more than 30 degrees without a problem. So here, which is farther north, It's worse. I mean, as I said, we're talking about Arctic regions. I also mentioned Norilsk. Norilsk is a city where one of the world's largest nickel mining companies operates. It's a mining city that was created because one of the largest open-pit nickel mines in the world is located there. The company is called Norilsk Nickel. It's Russian. And they built a city there, and it's inside the Arctic Circle. Yes, so you also see some amazing images with temperatures around -40.
The slurs with slanted eyes. The so-called, by the way, Mongolic fold. Right, that's what they call slanted eyes.
Yes, Asian-looking, let's say.
Yes, Asian appearance, slanted eyes. This was originally presented as an evolutionary development precisely against the cold and icy winds, right? Slanted eyes. That comes up in discussions about the existence of people with slanted eyes, for example, among indigenous peoples in South America.
That's actually very interesting because the migrations that took place, I mean, the Paleolithic population that arrived in America came from Asia. That's why we can find indigenous peoples who can... Sometimes we might mistake a Latin American indigenous person for a Russian, Yakut, Buryat, or even Mongolian indigenous person because they share a common origin, right? A common origin from maybe, I don't know, 20 or 30,000 years ago, but...
That's what I'm saying too. Now, what they apparently can't establish, Fernando, is a connection between the populations in which the so-called Mongolian fold, the slanted eyes, supposedly appeared through evolution, and tribes in parts of Africa that also have slanted eyes, but with no genetic or common relationship.
There may be evolutions, let's say.
Yes, like an evolution also in those areas, against the glare of the sun on the surface, so the body would have developed the same adaptation to protect the eyes. But well, this is interesting.
Well, what has been proven, for example, is that the highest place in the world, Tibet, the Great Tibetan Plateau, which is about 4,000 meters above sea level, shows that Tibetans have greater lung capacity as an adaptation to the lack of oxygen.
Well, in the American Andes too. And if not, anyone who has walked the Inca Trail, when you start with a big backpack, the people in charge of carrying the tents and everything else, by the time you take one step, they've already gone 100 meters. Tiny, Andean, small-framed, with incredible aerobic capacity, amazing people, carrying loads, just spectacular. Well, Fernando, we've already left geopolitics behind, as usual. Dear Fernando, as always, a pleasure. Once again, let's promote our Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook channels. Please join us, leave comments, likes, and if you can, memberships. That really helps us, of course. We'll be back again on Wednesday, once more, with Fernando. And Santiago Martinez's show has already started on our sister channel, MPG. Everyone, go watch Santiago, take advantage of it. Dear Fernando, a hug, and see you soon.
Querido Fernando, un abrazo y hasta pronto. Chau, chau.
Bye-bye. See you soon.